A word about ground rules for today. As I pose questions, each candidate will have 1.5 minutes to respond, followed by 30 seconds of rebuttal time each. If I pose follow-up questions, I'll state the time limit. I hope our speakers will respect the time limits, as we have a number of issues to explore. However, if I do grant additional time, the other candidate will also get the same amount of additional time. Our timekeeper, Jack DeLay, will raise a yellow card when a speaker is approaching the time limit, when about 15 seconds is left, and a red card when the time limit is reached. After questions from me and our name tag wearing members, each candidate will have 2 minutes for a closing statement, and the order of the closing statements was determined by a coin toss. Doug Ericksen was elected in 2010 to the state Senate for the 42nd District. He had previously served 6 terms as a member of the State House of Representatives following his election in 1998. Doug received his undergraduate degree in government from Cornell University and a master's degree from Western Washington University. Seth Fleetwood is an attorney with private practice in Bellingham. In 2001, he was elected to the Whatcom County Council, where he served 2 4-year terms. In 2009, he won election to Bellingham City Council, an at-large position, and was re-elected to a second 2-year term in 2011. Seth's undergraduate degree in political science is from the University of Washington, and he received a law degree from Willamette University. Now, our candidates may not agree on much, but they do share one thing. They're both products of the Bellingham Public Schools. Both Senator Ericksen and Mr. Fleetwood attended Lowell Elementary School, Fairhaven Middle School, and Seaholm High. So thanks for joining us today. We have a very lively debate. First question, let's go to Senator Ericksen. As you both are no doubt aware, it takes a huge commitment of time and energy to run for public office and to hold public office. Schedules are grueling, the budgets are tight, and the press is always on your back. And you can make a lot more money in the private sector. Why do you want this office, and what do you want to achieve?
Great, thank you all for having the event today. It's great to see so many people from Bellingham come out to the event today and from all around Whatcom County. My name is Doug Ericksen. I'm running for the state Senate, and really appreciate you all being here. Something amazing happened in Olympia 2 years ago when we formed the Majority Coalition Caucus, and that's why I want to go back to Olympia, to be honest with you. Right now in Olympia, we have the only bipartisan governing caucus in the United States of America, where Republicans and Democrats have come together to form a coalition in the Senate. It's called the Majority Coalition Caucus. We have Democrats that chair committees, we have Republicans that chair committees, we have co-chairs of committees in the Senate. The majority leader of the Senate is a Democrat. The President pro tem is a Democrat. The chairman of the Ways and Means Committee is a Republican. The Transportation Committee is co-chaired by Democrats and Republicans. This is unique. And because of that, we were able to pass the most bipartisan budget in the history of the state of Washington with that type of leadership in the Washington State Senate. And it's a good thing we have going right now, and that's why I want to go back to Olympia to continue to build upon the great things we got accomplished for the people here in Whatcom County due to that Majority Coalition Caucus. Those are the types of things that we can do to show how it can be done, that Olympia is not like Washington, D.C. You don't have a majority coalition in Washington, D.C. Democrats and Republicans are not looking to have co-chairs of committees and let the other party chair certain committees. It's unique here to Washington State. It was exciting to be a part of it. And for us in Whatcom County, I chair the Energy, Environment, and Telecommunications Committee. And what that means, in that capacity, we created what's called the Environmental Legacy and Stewardship Account, the ELSA Fund. And because of that, we're going to clean up the Georgia Pacific site faster, do it better, clean up Blaine Harbor faster and better, put people back to work. Those are the kinds of things we can build on, and that's why I'm running for re-election. Thank you for the red card.
Mr. Fleetwood.
I'm running because I enjoy public service. I don't know how it got into my blood, but it's definitely there. I get the most satisfaction out of working on issues of public concern. It's what got me into office initially when I ran for the Whatcom County Council. There were a whole series of issues that I cared deeply about, relating to how we were growing, relating to water quality in Lake Whatcom. I didn't think enough was being done to address protections for that absolutely important, necessary resource. And so I got into office, and it's always what I found to be most satisfying. I suspect through the course of today, and I will have a lively disagreement on the nature of the majority coalition and what that really means. I'm of the opinion that there's, in fact, enormous gridlock going on in Olympia right now. He cites a couple of the Democrats. Well, they, of course, were some of the people who joined, two of them. There's enormous gridlock going on in Olympia right now, and I'm running to try and end extreme partisanship in Olympia. The reference to the most bipartisan end of session agreement that he refers to is because there were a whole series of very important issues that didn't get resolved relating to transportation, clean energy, education. You could go on and on. But there's my card.
That's just the yellow. You get another 30 seconds.
Oh.
Don't feel you have to take every second.
So that's I find very appealing
That was a quick red card.
Okay,
I'll yield him the other 20 seconds to finish it off.
30-second rebuttal from the Senator.
You know, there's no way to say that the Majority Coalition Caucus is not a bipartisan entity. You have two members that caucus with us who are Democrats. You have others who are chairs of committees. You have others who were granted the opportunity in the Democrat Party to be chairs of committees and turned it down. Even Kevin Ranker, the 40th District Senator, was offered to be a chair of a committee, and he said no. So we are doing everything we can to reach across the aisle in a bipartisan fashion. And one thing that there wasn't just the final budget that was passed. The budget that came out of the Senate, the original one after the MCC was formed, included not only the Democrats who were part of the coalition, but many, many more Democrats joined with us to pass that budget in the most bipartisan first budget I have ever seen in Olympia.
Mr. Fleetwood, 30 seconds.
Well, just as it relates to bipartisanship, I guess the question would be, why then is there such difficulty in resolving some of the thorniest problems that we have? There's an enormous debate about how to fund education. Weren't able to come to an agreement on that. You'll cite, of course, the fact that the legislature came up with close to $1 billion. They did that because they were under the gun. They had 2 days before government was going to shut down. They did a whole bunch of inter-fund transfers that accounted for that $1 billion that you cite as an example of bipartisanship. And yet, on the education issue, there remains an enormous amount of funding that needs to be created for that. Haven't been able to settle that one. Haven't been able to settle the issue relating to clean energy. There wasn't a transportation package. I mean,
All right, our time is up on this one, so we will come back to this.
I'd imagine those issues might come up in your questions here at some point.
Okay, sorry.
So obviously there is an agreement on the majority coalition, a disagreement on the majority coalition. And it's clear that the majority coalition, notwithstanding that, our politics and our political discourse have become increasingly polarized in recent years. There's much less crossover voting than in the past. My question to you, Mr. Fleetwood, is what would you say to a Republican to get her vote?
I think so much of it that I think much of what we've lost in the last 40 years is an ability for people of both parties to communicate with each other, to genuinely like each other, to respect each other. There's a polarization that's happening, not just in local government, I would submit, but throughout our country. And it's not something that's just the fault of the Republicans or the Democrats, and precisely what created it and accounts for it perhaps is a difficult thing to identify with precision. But that it exists is something that's accepted by almost everyone that I talk to. When I go to the doors and talk about extreme partisanship and identify the observation that government seems to be broken, almost everybody I speak to nods their head. So there's certainly, at the very least, there's an enormous perception problem as it relates to that. And I think one way that I, as an individual, can try to help correct that is simply by an attitude that I would bring to the office. I would make an effort to be friendly with, communicate with, get to know people on both sides of the issue. I suspect we'd find that there's an enormous amount that we could agree upon. And I would observe that compromise is something that's required in our system. We like to talk about the Constitution. Compromising is a constitutional principle. It's something that our system was based upon. So, personal attitude of my own, I'd bring civility to the position, and I would attempt to reach across the aisle.
Thank you. Senator, what would you say to a Democrat?
Well, first off, it's not what you would say, it's what we are saying, what we have said, and what we've gotten done in Olympia. You know, one of the things I find frustrating is people keep talking about Washington, D.C. I think I've been to Washington, D.C. twice in the past 20 years. I don't go back there. I don't particularly care for it. You know, I don't like the weather, the climate, whatever. But Olympia is much smaller. It's much different. And people try to write this narrative of this incredible partisan divide, which doesn't exist. And what can we do? We can do things like form the majority coalition. We did it. We formed the majority coalition caucus. It's bipartisan. You have chairs that are Democrats and Republicans, co-chairs of committees. You know, not every bill gets passed, but you do go and you say, hey, we're going to dedicate 2/3 of budget growth to K-12 education, and that passes in a bipartisan fashion. You say, you know what, we're not going to raise tuition for college students for the first time in 30 years, and that passes with a bipartisan coalition. I rewrite the Model Toxin Control Act so we can invest more of those hazardous substance tax dollars into cleanups of contaminated sites, and it passes in a bipartisan fashion. You know, Governor Inslee and I don't agree on many things, you know, but the first thing we did, I said to the governor's office, your big issue is climate change. Let's get your bill out of my committee and let's pass it as quick as we possibly can. We gave the governor an hour to come in and testify on his bill. I went to leadership and said, I don't want to play politics with this bill. Let's pass it. Let's move it to the House. The House didn't amend the bill that came out of the Senate. They didn't amend it. They took it in total and passed it because we came together in a bipartisan fashion to say we're going to put politics aside to pass this bill. So it's not what you would do, it's what we did and what we will continue to do with the Majority Coalition Caucus.
Thank you. Mr. Fleetwood, 30 seconds.
What legislation were you referring to? Establishing
There was a lot of them there.
Was it related to Inslee?
Oh, yeah, we passed the CLUE bill, the Governor's Climate Change Task Force.
Right. So that was basically setting up a process whereby you would agree to have a discussion. And the discussion didn't go terribly well with that. And it didn't result in any recommendations, solutions. My understanding is
That's
that
not true. It
it's
did,
not?
but, yeah.
Okay. Well, we can go into that. It certainly didn't result in any substantive compromise on any major substantive legislation. And you can edify me on this, but my understanding is that in part because the CLUE didn't reach any successful conclusion, that the governor set up the task force, which is now considering ways in which we can try to increase the rate at which we convert to a clean energy economy. And he's doing that on his own authority. I don't believe that came about because of legislation. So I'm just suggesting that the CLUE process, as I understand it, you can, again, edify me on this, didn't result in any major substantive action.
Senator?
Sorry.
Yeah, Governor Inslee brought us legislation. We allowed the governor an hour to testify. We passed it out of the committee in a bipartisan fashion, passed it off the Senate floor in a bipartisan fashion. The House took it, did not amend it, and passed it in a bipartisan fashion. So what happened with the CLUE process were many moving pieces. We offered numerous ways to keep the CLUE going. We said, let's study cap and trade, let's study carbon tax, let's look at nuclear, let's look at new technology. We brought all of those things into the mix. At the end, and the governor unfortunately decided to go to California on his own without notifying the committee to sign an agreement. There are quite a few details of things that they were trying to suppress from members of that committee that led to some difficult issues. But in the end, we offered a pathway forward for the CLUE that would have included going into further detail on all of those issues. The governor decided to walk away from the process and form his own, which is his right to do. So the governor can do that.
Thank you. Let's move to another subject. As you know, the Washington State Supreme Court in the McCleary case has ordered the state to fully fund public education at an estimated cost of $5 billion needed by 2017. And last week held the legislature and the state in contempt for not making enough progress. What would you do as senator to either raise revenue or make budget cuts to ensure the state meets its obligations? Senator?
First off, you hit one of my key terms of words. In Olympia, we don't have revenue, we have taxes. You know, the government doesn't have revenue. We have money that we take from the people through taxation and fees. So I don't believe we need to raise taxes in Washington State, and I believe we should require a 2/3 vote of the legislature before we even consider going down that pathway of raising taxes. Over 65% of the 42nd district voted to require a 2/3 vote, and I stand by that, and I agree with it. But here's the problem. I didn't bring enough for everybody. Didn't know there'd be so many people here. It's a chart that shows budget growth in Washington State over the past 30 years, where general government grew at over twice the rate of K-12 spending. Think about that for a second. Education, paramount duty, and it's actually worse is in the Gregoire years, where general government grew at a much faster rate than education spending. So what did we do in the 2 years where the Majority Coalition Caucus was able to write the budget? We dedicated 2/3 of budget growth to K-12 education. 13% of budget growth under our budget went to K-12, which was the highest percentage of any group. Higher than the House Democrats, higher than the governor's budget, was the Majority Coalition Caucus proposal on K-12 spending. We grew general government at 4%. So we grew general government at 4%. Think about that. We also grew that portion, just not as fast, because we said K-12 education is going to be a priority. So going forward, first thing we should do is pass Senator Andy Hill's bill, who is the chair of the committee, that says for the next 6 years we're going to dedicate 2/3 of budget growth to K-12 and higher education, number one. And then we start looking at other ways to put more money in the system and through reforms. It's not just about money. It's how we empower local school districts, local school boards, and local teachers with greater control in the classroom and take a lot of Olympia out of the mix.
Mr. Fleetwood.
I think this is another example that demonstrates perhaps a difference in style. I could agree that there could well be appropriate reforms. There's always room for something like that. When you talk about the 2/3 budget all being directed to K through 12, it sounds really good. It sounds like there's an effort to go back to a more appropriate ratio with more money towards education. But I think one of the failures in it is that it doesn't do complete cost-benefit analysis. It just looks at the benefits of it. One of the costs of that proposal, as you know, is that there would be significant cuts required in services to some of our most disadvantaged citizens, some of whom include low-income students. So as we talk about the gap relating to more disadvantaged students, that would help grow that. So I think we need something that is a compromise. We need to look at some reforms. We need to look at where cuts can occur. But we also have to contemplate revenue. And how we do that's the difficult part. One way to do it that's been proposed by the Senate Democratic Caucus is to look at closing corporate tax loopholes. Not all of them. There's 600 some on the books. And many of them are absolutely appropriate and serve their stated statutory purpose. But there are some that are outdated and no longer accomplishing what they were intended to do, and they should at least be reviewed. I think there's significant income that could come from that and go to funding public education.
Senator, 30 seconds.
Well, I think you're seeing one of the main differences that Seth used the term revenue and income for the state of Washington. We have taxes. We don't have income. We have what we take from the people of Washington State to spend on projects. And I'd like to see Seth's list of tax incentives he would like to eliminate, because two big ones on the chopping block from the Senate Democrats for next year are the tax incentives for our oil refineries at Cherry Point and the tax incentive that we put in place in a bipartisan fashion to keep Alcoa operating and put them back into business out there. You lose those tax incentives at Cherry Point, you're talking thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs that you are putting potentially at risk because you want to raise taxes on manufacturing jobs in Whatcom County.
Mr. Fleetwood, 30 seconds.
What I'm talking about is a commitment to a review. Where the exemptions should be closed is something that involves a significant process, and it's a thoughtful process that requires people from both parties sitting down in committee and having conversations. I simply believe that there are some that could appropriately be closed, and I look forward to being involved in looking at those.
Which ones?
You're the one that's been in Olympia for 20 years. I haven't.
I just named two I don't support. Would you say you don't support those either right now, saying you won't vote to repeal the tax credits for BP and Phillips 66?
Well, I guess hog fuel.
What? Recycled fuel?
Recycled fuel.
Yeah.
That's one that could be looked at.
You'd like to repeal that one?
Well, it's one that went into
The Senate
effect
Democrats wanted to repeal it, so.
Right, that's one that accounts, that was something created before the refineries were even there. It applied to wood chips. I mean, it didn't apply to oil. I think that might be one that's outdated and could be looked at.
So it's never been applied to the refineries, because it was put in place in 1945 and the refineries were built in the 50s. And it's an environmental benefit because you're using less fuel, producing less greenhouse gases, but you'd like to repeal it.
Let's follow up on this.
I just said we should review,
We're
that's
hearing
all.
a lot of discussion about potential sources of revenue or taxes, as you wish, through loopholes. But I didn't hear anything looking at specific cuts that might need to be made, because it doesn't sound like we're going to be able to do this entirely through closing corporate loopholes. Are there specific cuts in programs that need to be made to be able to meet the McCleary ruling? Mr. Fleetwood?
That's a question that people running for office always get. What are the cuts? And cutting is something that I experienced in after the recession when I was on the county council and involved in approving budgets and reviewing budgets and amending budgets. It was during the boom times, at least most of my time on the county council, and then we experienced the Great Recession. And during my time when I switched to the Bellingham City Council, it was cutting. And it's a very hard process. When you're looking to be impressed by someone that identifies precisely what the cuts, an incumbent would be better qualified to do that. But what I can tell you is that cutting is part of a very thoughtful process. You're balancing competing priorities of public services for elimination. And usually you find, especially in a lean budget, that everything's been scrutinized for cuts. Most of every public service, you'll find some constituency out there that benefits from it. So it's a hard thing to do. We already have a lean government. Does that mean that there aren't things that can still be cut? I'm sure there are. But it's a thoughtful process of balancing competing priorities for elimination. It's complicated. And I would commit to doing that, because that's part of what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to find some cuts, and we're going to have to find some revenues.
Senator?
Yeah, I think, corporate tax loopholes, there's another loaded term. It's a tax incentive. One person's loophole is another person's job, particularly when you start talking about tax incentives out here at Cherry Point for our manufacturing industries. And that will cost physical jobs on the ground if you start going through and removing those tax incentives. But to get to your question, we anticipate over $3 billion of additional tax money coming from the taxpayers of Washington State into our next budget. Over $3 billion of additional on top of what received, just in our general fund. This is where budgeting gets a bit complicated. There are things that we can do to always be more efficient. I would disagree that the state of government is a lean operation right now. I do not believe that is true. I don't think it's very lean at all. I'd like to see us continue to work on reforming our healthcare system to become more efficient. And we have great examples in Whatcom County of how that can be done to deliver services in a different way, manage chronic illnesses better at the state level, are things that we should be looking at. We should be looking at ways that we can contract out services. We recently created the Department of Enterprise Services within the government to look at places where we can say, is it more efficient for the state to do it, or is it more efficient for a private vendor to be the one that provides this service? We looked at the print shop in Olympia. And we decided that's probably a better place to look at private vending. Now the Department of Enterprise Services needs to review about 5 every year and come back to the legislature with suggestions on a way that we can be more efficient and look at parts of government that maybe somebody else could try to provide to the public. So those are the kinds of things that we can be looking at doing. But really what you need to do, and what we did as the Majority Coalition Caucus, you go in, you say how much money's coming in. Let's set priorities and let's fund priorities and move forward in that fashion. And dedicating 2/3 of money to education is a big step in that direction.
Mr. Fleetwood, 30 seconds.
To the degree it's not lean, in your view, I would look forward to having that kind of discussion. I'd like to hear the views of people who disagree. You would be one of them. And learn about why you believe that. That discussion could be had. I would enjoy those sorts of discussions. I don't shy away from talking to people with differing viewpoints. And often there's a degree of truth in what people say, who you might otherwise generally be inclined to disagree with. As it relates to the increase in taxes that you referred to that's forecast, I'd say, again, you don't do the complete cost-benefit analysis. You just talked about the benefit of that increased taxation, to use your term, revenue. What you didn't mention is that they're also projecting, because of increased costs, $1 billion deficit. So we're going to be back in cutting mode again this year.
Senator?
We don't have a $1 billion budget deficit coming into the next legislative session. It's just not accurate. And there are many things that we can do within our budgeting system to fund priorities without having to go and raise taxes to people of Washington State. And the key way to do it is just say 2/3 vote of the legislature to raise taxes. That way you know that the legislature agrees. You have to work in a bipartisan fashion before you think about doing that.
Let's just stay on education for just one more minute here. As you know, there's also serious commitment to higher education in this state. Are we going to be in a situation where we have to make that choice, funding for higher education versus funding for K-12? Senator?
Well, again, you know, when I say 2/3 of budget growth goes to education, that includes higher education. And I just would like to highlight that, you know, you look at what people do in Olympia when they have the gavel in their hands, and that's an indicator of what they want to do. Because when you have the gavel, that means you're the chair, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or a co-chair of a committee. And what we did was we froze college tuition increases. And what was important about doing that is it put the GET program back on track. Because by freezing tuition, that made this program, brought it back into solvency with regards to people who have made those investments for college tuition in the future. By doing that, that was crucial. So we made the commitment and we did it. What we're hearing a lot of questions about are things you'll do in the future. And I think one of the key things to know what will happen in the future is to go and look at what happened for the past 2 years in terms of setting priorities and funding priorities. And clearly what we did is we made K-12 education and higher education a priority in our budget. And we funded it. It doesn't mean that we didn't, rest of government got a 4% increase also. It grew. So this is what you can do going forward if you set priorities and fund priorities in the future in Olympia. So higher education will be a commitment. It wasn't a commitment under past administrations until the majority coalition took over, because you saw record tuition increases under the previous administrations and previous majorities. You saw 0 tuition increase under the majority coalition caucus.
Mr. Fleetwood?
Well, education is one of the most important things that we can do. It's a necessary commitment, not just on a moral level, but it's an important investment in our future. It's the way in which we're going to be competitive in the future. The reference to 2/3 increase in revenue, taxation, going to education, again, it just describes the benefits. It doesn't go into the costs, in my view. It doesn't discuss the implication of doing that as it relates to other important services that a humane community would be committed to. The reference to tuition, the freeze after years and years and years of increases. I think we were one of the fastest growing in tuition increased states in the country. And to the degree that that freeze occurred, okay, that's good, but let's contemplate the implication of it. You imply that it solves the problem. It doesn't. It means that all of the colleges, the community colleges, the universities, all of the ones who receive higher ed public funds are having to do the same with less money. And so there are cuts. So an argument, it's a benefit immediately for the students that don't have to pay as much. That's a good thing. But the amount of public assistance to higher education that used to be 70% is now 30%. It doesn't solve the problem.
Senator,
It's not
30
sustainable.
seconds.
You should be debating Chris Gregoire and not me if you're so concerned about what happened to college funding, because she was the leader when college funding was slashed. Last year in the budget that we put together, we increased higher education spending by 13%. 13% growth. You can't get it all back in 1 year. I mean, after the years and years and years of slashing that budget and balancing the budget for everything else on the back of higher ed, we made the commitment. We turned it around. Not only 0 tuition increases for students, but a 13% increase in spending on higher education under that budget. So you say, what will we do? We'll do what we've been doing, because we showed the commitment to get it done.
Mr. Fleetwood?
You're talking about the $1 billion?
This is in addition to the K-12 money. So you have
Right.
13% increase, I can give you the exact, $353 million in additional spending to higher education, 13% of their overall budget.
Yeah. Well, once again, there's an implication of that. Where did you find the money? You did one-time fund transfers. You didn't give a COLA to teachers who hadn't had their COLA in years and years and years, and they were appropriately looking forward to a cost of living and adjustment. They hadn't done it for years, and the budget had been balanced in large part on not giving those things that there were expectations of having. And so it's not a sustainable way of addressing the problem. The sustainable way of addressing the problem is by committing to a process that would involve some cuts and a process that would include some revenue. And the question is how we go about finding that revenue.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Fleetwood, in your campaign literature, you, quote, support the right of responsible people to own guns. And you've presented that position through the lens of personal freedom, along with a woman's right to reproductive choice, and even opposing red light cameras in the past. There are two competing gun rights measures on the ballot. I-594, which would extend universal background checks to sales from gun shows and private transactions, and I-591, which would prevent such an extension by prohibiting agencies from conducting any background checks beyond the national standard. What's your position on these two measures?
Well, I observe that there's a constitutional provision called the Second Amendment. There is a general acceptance amongst the public, amongst the courts, that confers the right of responsible people to carry and own guns. So yes, I support the Second Amendment. I think responsible people can own a gun. As it relates to the initiatives, I support 594. And the reason for that is that the reasoning in support of having the background checks that we presently have is the same reasoning that should apply for people who are engaged in private gun sales, which is to make sure that criminals or people who are mentally unstable don't own a gun. So yes, I support 594 because it's the rational thing to do.
Senator, what's your position on the initiatives?
Yeah, I don't support 594 and 591 either way. 594 would make it illegal if Seth and I go out to the shooting range and I hand him my gun to shoot. I've now just committed a crime under 594. People are saying, no, no, no. Read the initiative. You cannot transfer that gun to other people.
No, no. No, no. The
594 goes a lot further than what is being told to you in the ads. So there you go. I guess I'll stop my conversation on that. Just be clear, I don't support 594, and 591 just says federal law will be the law of the state of Washington. which
Mr.
has
Fleetwood,
background checks.
Uh,
any rebuttal?
Well, I think that it all comes down to presumably the objection to it is what people would perceive as the bother of going through the background check process. I think it's a small price to pay to own a gun, and it protects the public. So I support 594.
Senator?
I don't want to bring the house down again, so I don't support 594. And 591 simply says federal law will be enforced in Washington. So,
Okay. I think we have a clear difference of opinion here. Both of you referred earlier to the refineries. The 42nd District is home to 2 oil refineries that bring both benefits and risks. As we learned at last month's City Club meeting, our community is seeing an unprecedented number of giant oil trains from the Bakken region of North Dakota. These same type of trains are occasionally seen on the news derailing and exploding in communities in the United States and Canada. What would you do as a senator to get oil safety legislation through the legislature and protect our communities from the dangers posed by these trains and the increase in tanker traffic?
mm-hmm. First off, one of the important things we need to be focused on, one of the good opportunities we have is for energy independence in North America. And energy independence involves crude oil that'll be coming out of the Midwest now from the Bakken region and other parts. So this could be a great thing for our economy nationwide. This could be a great thing for our economy locally. But safety has to be job one. We have to do it right, and we have to do it safely, when we start talking about the transport of oil products through our regions. That's why last year, as chair of the committee, we brought forward the most comprehensive package of oil by rail safety legislation in the country. We included safer tanker cars, which the federal government has to do, we can't do at the state and local level. We included legislation to put over $10 million into first responders for prevention first, and then for protection should a spill occur. $10 million, the only legislation that offered that up was the legislation that I introduced. We had legislation to complete planning for safety routes all along the rail lines throughout Washington State. We included notification of first responders in Washington State, which was taken care of at the federal level in a much better way by having the railroad do it, which I support, as opposed to having refiners do it at the local level, which was not a very good way to have that accomplished. So we introduced that as the most comprehensive package of bills nationwide. Now, Governor Inslee has taken that as the blueprint for what he's currently doing through his executive actions. What we have to get done is to have to do the 5-cent barrel fee, which is currently attached to tankers when they come in on the ocean to our refineries, and apply that 5-cent per barrel tax onto the tanker cars as they come in, so we can continue to fund the programs long term. So we introduced the most comprehensive package of bills in the nation last year. Inslee has taken the ones and made it his blueprint for improving it, and we'll continue to work on it next year to make sure we're doing it safe and we're doing it right.
Mr. Fleetwood?
Well, here's one where I think we have as if it's the first one, where we have a difference of opinion. It didn't pass. So the measure of success in Olympia isn't by the number of bills that you throw in the hopper, it's by the bills that you produce that get passed and signed into law. If this was a case where there was a true commitment to oil by rail safety, there would have been compromise, because there were bills in the House, for example. There was something, if you're going to say that the majority coalition constitutes bipartisanship because there are 2 Democrats that joined the coalition.
It's more than 2.
Okay, well then we can refer to we can look at oil by rail safety legislation, and the House had bipartisan legislation. It included all sorts of important things. It included funding sources, notification requirements, necessary studies that needed to be done. Go on, right on down the line. Many of them lined up with the sorts of provisions that you wanted. Yours took out some of the most important notification requirements because presumably the refineries who you represent didn't want to have that. What I would point out and illustrate is that if there was a true commitment to passing this kind of legislation for our communities, it would have passed. There would have been evidence on the record of working on this effort, on this issue before the session even began, talking to stakeholders from both sides of, on all sides of the issue, having thoughtful conversations, doing the hard work to create important legislation. Crafting legislation and building coalitions to successfully pass something is hard work, and it didn't happen.
Senator?
Thank you, Seth. I'd be curious to see which parts you didn't think were included in my bill, but here's what happened in Olympia. We brought forward a piece of legislation, and it was a partisan breakdown in the legislative process when this bill came up. Only once during the past 2 years have the Senate Democrats used a procedural motion to refuse to give a bill a bump. And so that means you delay a vote. We had the bill lined up for a vote on the Senate floor. Senator Christine Rolfes stood up, objected to bringing that bill up for a vote on the Senate floor for purely political reasons, because she wanted to have that as a campaign issue in this cycle. She prevented the vote that we could have taken on the floor to vote on that legislation, and that was wrong. The only time Senate Democrats used that procedural motion to prevent a vote was on this bill, which included, Seth, pretty much everything you just said, from notification to response to the other aspects that was included within that particular piece of legislation. So that was wrong. We tried hard to get it back up for a vote, and it did not happen. It was because my good friend Christine Rolfes, a senator from Bainbridge Island, prevented the vote on that particular bill.
Mr. Fleetwood?
Well, the House bill that had bipartisan support, that had a whole series of excellent provisions that would have protected our communities, not just in Bellingham and Whatcom County and throughout this region, but across the state, had a companion bill that was in your committee, and you didn't give it a hearing. You didn't even debate it.
We heard the other bill that included much of the same stuff. But if you go look at it, that bill was 80% barge traffic through the San Juans and islands, which we already have an excellent program. My bill was 95% oil by rail, which is the emerging issue that we should be focused in on.
Okay, I think we have another disagreement here. A follow-up on this subject. The Washington State Council of Firefighters has urged a moratorium on the shipment of oil by rail until a safety study ordered by the governor has been completed in March. Mr. Fleetwood, do you support such a moratorium?
I'd need to better understand the implications of a moratorium. I mean, there's some obvious implications that come right off the bat. And so I don't feel as though I'm in a position right now to assert a final opinion on the question of a moratorium. I'd want to study it.
Okay. Senator?
No, I don't support the moratorium. What we have to do is transition to the newer rail cars faster, and that's why Senator Steve O'Ban had what we call a Senate Joint Memorial to Congress, which did pass the Senate in a bipartisan fashion, urging the federal government to have new standards in place faster, which is what we need because these companies are going to be making very large investments in new rail cars, and so we have to make sure the standards are there so they can build the new tanker cars to those standards. Currently, BP is upgrading their fleet as quickly as possible, and if you go and look at the ones currently coming through Whatcom County, the vast majority of those cars are newly built cars that meet newer safety standards. So we are working very hard to get that accomplished. When they start talking about oil transfer stations in Grays Harbor and the Columbia River, if those are built, it'll be a couple years out, and the new federal standards will be in place for those particular rail cars before those facilities are constructed and operating. So it's important that we get that done. We had the Senate Joint Memorial. We have signed letters in bipartisan fashion. We have called the federal government and said take care of it, but the Interstate Commerce Clause prevents us from being able to have to do it ourselves. It has to be a partnership with the federal government. That's what we did, and that's what we're moving towards.
Mr. Fleetwood, anything more?
Was that a 30-second response?
Well, I would just observe that Doug's campaign material touts the importance of his legislation as though he has overseen the protection of our communities, and in fact, they haven't even passed. The only thing that passed was the Senate Joint Memorial, which was simply a letter to the federal government asking them to do what they already knew they were supposed to do. So you don't measure success by whether you threw a bill in the hopper. You measure success by what gets passed.
Okay, let's have one more question from me before I open it up to our members. At a previous City Club meeting, we heard Bill Dewey of Taylor Shellfish Farms tell us that ocean acidification brought on by climate change is threatening the shellfish industry by making it harder for oysters to develop shells. It's also a threat to the salmon fishery because acidification impacts the organisms that the salmon eat. Is there anything the legislature can do to help protect these important local industries? Senator?
Well, we worked on this issue last year through the legislative process. Senator Ranker from the 40th District is a major voice on this particular item, and we included the ocean acidification study language through the University of Washington in funding, both in legislation that we passed and in terms of the budget that was passed by the legislature in a bipartisan fashion. So we've added it to the legislation to look at it, to study it. It's a unique situation here in Western Washington, the shellfish beds. If you check ocean acidification levels in Hawaii or off the coast of Vancouver Island, it's very different. That's why you're getting some of these oyster larvae being brought in from different parts where it's not the same issue. So we have to find out what's going on locally so we can address it going forward. And that's why we put money into it, and that's why it was included in legislation in Olympia to look at that issue. Was it as much as some people would have liked? Perhaps not, but money is tight. And when Seth talks about setting priorities, you have to look overall at the budget in places where we can put money. So we included it in legislation, we put money into it for the research, and we will continue studying the issue and taking corrective action as the studies come back as needed.
Mr. Fleetwood?
Well, let's look at it from a little bit higher up. Acidification is caused by burning of fossil fuels. It relates to greenhouse gases and global warming, and that's something that the evidence in support of that happening is well settled. My understanding is that Doug's on the record being agnostic and not sure whether or not that's the case. To me, it's absolutely well settled. And acidification is one of the causes or the effects, and it's really horrifying. Bill Dewey, who was cited, observing the implication of acidification in the aquaculture, also said that we are just at the tip of the iceberg as it relates to the effects in Puget Sound. We observed them. It became sort of well known, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even before that. But I recall that's when it came into the sort of the public sphere. And he said at a talk not long ago that based on ocean currents and cycles of ocean currents, there is ocean currents that are still going to be coming in, flowing into Puget Sound in the form of upwelling over the next 30 years in concentrations that are even higher than they are now. So I would express a very strong commitment to doing everything that we can to prepare for it. It's going to have a huge effect on our economy in Washington State. It's an enormous problem, and I think that there's an increased likelihood, just based on my position on the broader question of climate science, that I would be able to address it in a more effective way.
Senator, is this something you guys can agree on?
But yeah, there's a lot of wiggle room when Seth says do everything humanly possible to address it. I'm not quite sure what that means.
I didn't say humanly. I don't
Okay,
think.
well, I forget the term you used right there, but you said do everything. I'm not sure what that means. No, we have to find out what's going on. And to say the science is settled on ocean acidification to understand the cause and the upwellings and everything else that's occurring, why it's more happening here more than other places. You can't say that. That's why we're putting money into the R&D to find out what's going on so we can take action if it's necessary. So we'll keep working on it. This is an important issue, and it's important that we keep working on it, but it's not a political issue. It's one we have to go out, do the research, and get the science.
Thanks.
And
Mr. Fleetwood?
I agree with, we agree on something. We agree on that. We agree that there's work that needs to be done and studies that need to be done. And I hope it continues. I just hope that the resources to do that work are adequate.
Okay, on that note, let's open up questions from our members. Again, these questions can come from members who are wearing name tags. You'll find 2 gentlemen with microphones patrolling the rooms. Make yourself known to them, and we'll alternate between microphones.
You know, I keep hearing this bipartisan objective. I keep hearing this bipartisan talk. As I understand it, there's not really bipartisanship. That simply a couple of Democratic senators turncoated, and yeah, it became Republicans in maybe not in name, but in practice. I can't feel that that's bipartisan.
We do need a question.
My question is, what do you mean by bipartisan?
Okay. I guess both of us can answer that one. So let's take a look at it.
Let's take 60 seconds for each of you on this one.
Well, only place in the country where you have a majority coalition caucus. It's not only the majority leader who is a Democrat and the president pro tem who is a Democrat. It's chairs of committees who are Democrats and co-chairs of committees who are Democrats. That's never happened before. How can you get more bipartisan than having some Republican chairs, some Democrat chairs, and co-chairs of committees? Having a caucus that's made up of Republicans and Democrats. It's not just 2 people. And I'd also like to highlight, in the initial offer that was made to the Democrat caucus, it included lots of people having co-chairmanships and more Democrats having chairmanships, but a lot of them rejected it, including Senator Ranker, who was offered a chairmanship within the structure, and he said no. So who's more partisan, the person that offers to give you a chairmanship when you're in the majority, or the person who says, no, I don't want to have a chairmanship to represent my district because it would be being part of the MCC? So I understand your bias, the term turncoat. Senator Tom and Senator Sheldon and Senator Hobbs and Senator Hatfield and Senator Eide took up the charge of bipartisanship and said they wanted to do what was in the best interest of their district and serve in a majority coalition caucus that was focused in on balancing a budget without raising taxes.
Mr. Fleetwood.
I guess I would just underscore, if it's so effective, then why aren't we seeing the kinds of results on the most difficult issues facing us? I mean, I've spoken already to my opinion of the benefits of the majority coalition. As it relates to bipartisanship in general, though, I'm not sitting here piously acting as though, in my view, it's only the Republicans that behave in a partisanship way. I think it goes around. I think it's an attitude that's become pervasive in our government today. I think back, as I'd mentioned earlier, the 42nd District for many years was represented by 60s and 70s by Frank Atwood, who was a well-regarded moderate Republican, and for a long time represented by Barney Goltz, who was a well-regarded, well-respected, liked Democrat. And those were days when it seemed to me there was much more ability to reach general agreement and compromise on issues, and government worked better. And
Senator, any response to that? Okay.
Hello, a question for Doug here. I think on August 1st there was something in the Bellingham Herald where you were responding about the influence of lobbyists, and you said you were focused on your constituents and not on lobbyists. But apparently sometime a few days before that you were at the Suncadia Resort with some oil industry lobbyists shooting some golf. And my question is whether or not they paid for that trip like they paid for the one last year.
Thank you, Richard. It's so much fun coming to clubs like this. And I'm sure when Senator Ranker was sitting up here, you asked him about his Penwar trip, which was paid for by BP, PSE, oil and gas companies out of Alaska and Canada. Did you ask Kevin about his trip to Penwar? No, that's a no. So what happens, I spoke at an event at Suncadia. Yeah, we go and speak at a lot of events where you're asked to come and speak at events. So it's a silly question I think you're trying to drive down with regards to what you're trying to say with that. Many legislators go and speak at many events. Senator Ranker goes and speaks at many events, paid for by different sources. I'm sure Senator Spinell went to many events that were paid for by different entities to speak. Well, maybe you never got asked to go speak, Senator. I don't know. So those kind of questions are very frustrating because you ask it in a very combative way, but if you actually dig through what happens in those things, Richard, you're going out and you're working with constituents, you're talking about issues that are important, you're meeting with many different groups.
Mr. Fleetwood?
I guess on this issue, the only thing I would say is that Doug, of course, has referred to the designation regarding receiving lobbyist money, and the most in the state, and I'm sure it is the case that many people receive those sorts of offers. But in your defense of that, you have suggested that it's simply an accounting error in the way that the rules work. They simply take the total expense cost and divide it by the number of people who are present. So you could be there eating celery sticks and ranch, and somebody else could be drinking an entire bottle of wine, and you get charged the same amount. But if you go back and look at the record, there's an awful lot of times where you're one-on-one having dinner with someone from the Western Petroleum Association, whatever it might be. That's not necessarily bad. I think what the problem is that it creates the appearance of a special bias in favor of a particular constituency. And when the voting is such that it seems to comport with that, it creates an actual bias. And when there's an actual bias, it means you're not independent. And that's it.
Seth, you have absolutely no basis for that
let's
statement. But here's what I'll do for you, though, Seth. I'm not sure if you paid for your lunch today, but I'd be happy to cover it for you for the City Club today for $18, so they don't have to report it. Because this is what a lot of the meals are in Olympia. When you go out with folks, you'll be speaking to a group. So did you pay for your meal here today for $18?
We both were gifted it because we were the guests.
Well, there you go. What's the difference then, Seth? I mean, you're trying to make this into an issue. You're making a pretty outrageous statement. I meet with lots of people in Olympia, all different types of people, educators, school board members. I'll meet with people that have jobs in Whatcom County, and you're trying to say that because I meet with these people, somehow my votes are being bought. That's what you just said, and that's an absolutely ridiculous statement for you to say.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that. What I said was that it creates an appearance of a bias in favor of a particular constituency when you go back in the reports and it shows a whole series of dinners with a special interest group.
Which one? How many?
Well, we used to have the muckraking press who would actually go and look, and we could find that. Go read the reports that are filed with the Public Disclosure Commission.
Okay, let's move on to another question here.
I'd like to ask each of you to give us a brief summary of the sources of your campaign contributions. Give us an idea of how many of those contributions come from small individual donors, how many of them come from larger corporate and business interests, and how many of them are from outside the state of Washington. Thank you.
Mr. Fleetwood?
Well, as it relates to money and in politics, I wish that we had a system where we could not have that. I wish there was another system. There are examples around the world of countries who have created meaningful campaign finance reform. It would be nice to get money out of politics. I receive donations, money from groups, just as Doug does. Unfortunately, in this system, it's the way in which we create parity, so that there can be something that looks like a fair fight. To get to the specifics of your question, I have received, I think, 75% of my contributions from individuals. The remainder comes from the sorts of groups that standardly give to Democrats. Doug receives money. He gets parity from the groups that in our system standardly give to Republicans. It's the way the system works.
Senator?
I hope in the future we can reform that.
Campaign contributions are what they are in politics. They're all displayed on the PDC page. You know, we have tons and tons of local donors that I'm very proud about, including companies that are voluntary PACs, like the BP Workers Voluntary PAC, Alcoa Workers Voluntary PAC, where those people voluntarily contribute funds to be used for political purpose to protect their jobs here in Whatcom County. So we work very hard on that. I think if you compare donors of in-district and in-district companies and in-district employers, you'll see that my campaign is far in the lead. And I anticipated the question, so I pulled down Zest's numbers. And of the some 1,000-odd individual donors that he claims on his PDC reports, 204 of them actually live in the 42nd district. So that means over 900 of his individual donors don't live in the 42nd district that he wants to represent. So I would ask you, who has more interest in the 42nd district, the BP Voluntary Employee PAC or downtown Seattle millionaires who go to an event, have their contributions, clustered together and then presented? So I'm very proud of my in-district support from.
Response, Mr. Fleetwood?
Well, I think we've got pretty close to the same amount of money that's come in from Seattle. I'd point out that I have more individual contributors from the 42nd district than my opponent.
Senator?
Well, we'll go check the tail of tape on that one, but I think it'll be pretty close. You have 204 for $17,000 out of district.
Okay.
You've got $100,000 more than I do.
Let's
overall.
move on to closing statements here. We decided this with a coin toss earlier. Mr. Fleetwood won the toss and elected to go second. So, Senator, floor is yours for 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Well, I just want to thank you all for coming out here today. It was an interesting conversation. I'd like to thank the respectful crowd that was here to come and hear about issues and talk about things important to Whatcom County in the 42nd District. You know, I think a constant theme in here was this issue of partisanship, both in terms of the questions. Partisanship in Olympia, no matter how you want to slice it and dice it and cut it up, you have a majority coalition caucus of Republicans and Democrats, which is unique anywhere in our country. That's doing it. It's not just talking about how you work in a bipartisan fashion. It doesn't mean that every issue you want to pass will pass. You know, we didn't talk about transportation today, which we need to talk about because we need to reform our transportation system so we can invest more dollars in roads. That needs to happen. We didn't get there over the past 2 years, but we're going to keep working to get it done. And that's the way things work in Olympia. You bring them together, but I think what you have to look at is what we're able to get accomplished. And what we said is we're going to focus in on the budget. We're going to fund education. We're going to take care of higher ed. We're going to set the size of the box. We're going to balance our budget for 4 years without raising your taxes, and we did it in a bipartisan fashion. And that first budget that came out of the Senate, after all of the hoopla, after all of the hurt feelings of people who lost their chairmanships, who refused to join the MCC, that first budget that came out of the Senate was the most bipartisan first budget we have seen in my time in Olympia, with over 9 Democrats who are not members of the majority coalition, I think it's either 8 or 9, joining with us to create 12 to 13 Democrat votes in favor of that budget in a bipartisan fashion. That's what we can do if we work together on these issues. So what I love to do is bring Whatcom County values and solutions to Olympia. The 42nd District is a great place. I'm proud to be supported by ag interests, business interests, all different types of people throughout Whatcom County. It's a great place. It's great to live here in Whatcom County and raise my family with my wife, Tasha. Tasha's a school teacher up at Squalicum High School, does a great job. My daughter, Elsa, who was born my second year in the legislature, is now a freshman at Ferndale High School. And my younger daughter, Addie, is a 7th grader at Horizon High School. We're committed to our community. We're committed to living here. I'm committed to living here in the coming years and working hard for the people of Whatcom County. Thank you for being here. It's always an honor to represent. It's always a challenge to come to the City Club, but it's always fun because your questions are challenging, and it gives me a good opportunity to get used to going back down to Olympia and working with Governor Inslee.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Fleetwood.
I want to, my throat's getting a little scratchy here. I want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to thank Doug. You know, we run in this, thank you. We run in races like this, and it gets confrontational. It gets rather intense. We've got lots of people that are supporting me, lots of people who are supporting Doug, and lots of things that are being said. And put that all aside, the truth of the matter is, I don't dislike you, Doug. And
I saw a couple out here that do, though.
No. We grew up in the same neighborhood and have a lot of similar kinds of experiences, at least in our early life. I'm running on a theme of trying to end what I regard as gridlock. We do have a difference of opinion on that. That was very clear today. I think that there are a whole series of really important issues that haven't been tackled successfully. I think there are a lot of problems that are getting worse. We didn't pass a transportation package. It cost Whatcom County lots and lots of jobs. We're under the McCleary decision that says we're not meeting our constitutional mandate. And there's clearly going to be a big debate about how we come up with funds to do that. I offer a fresh voice, new energy. Doug's been there a long time. I think we'd benefit from a change. I know that's self-serving. But I'd be honored by an opportunity to serve all of you in Olympia. Thank you very much.
There you go.